do we have permission to record this interview?
Yes, yes you do.
Okay. Where and when were you born?
May 14th, 1958 in the Peabody Hospital in Webster, South Dakota, the same hospital where Tom Brokaw and Myron Florin were born.
Wow. That's pretty impressive.
Especially the Myron Florin part.
Yeah, absolutely. What was your very first job?
I was a paper boy for the Minneapolis Tribune, and I had to lie about my age to get the job.
How old were you?
I was 10, and I think you had to be 12.
Really? Back in the day when there was actual real papers to be delivered.
Yeah, I ended up subsuming, taking over all the routes in town by the end, and so I had a huge paper route, which the Sunday Minneapolis Tribune was a humongous paper. My dad had to drive me around.
I remember that we used to drive downtown Pier, because it was always like at Dakota Mart. We could pick up that Sunday paper. It was great. I know I've heard you talk about this a little bit before, but tell us a little bit about your family's history within the state of South Dakota.
Sure. Let me just count for sure. 1, 2, 3. So on my dad's side, Großvater would have come here in the 1880s, and Großmutter too. They'd be Ukrainian. I mean, they're Germans from Russia. On my mom's side, the Schmidts and the Meyers also came in about the 1880s, first to Iowa and then to South Dakota. So all of my great-grandparents are buried in Day County, South Dakota. And my family on both sides were farmers. You can read an article. I wrote it for South Dakota Magazine about my grandpa who drowned saving a bunch of people's lives in '37. My grandma was a country school teacher. Rod Leffoltz, who ran for Attorney General, was one of her students in country grade school. She had a library in her house in Butler, South Dakota, where I could check books out on the weekends. And my mom's, and after everybody lost their land in the Depression, and all of them did, they moved from Andover. Congressman Frank Denholm, a relative by marriage, where he's from, over to Lilly, South Dakota, all still in Day County. Nobody got out of Day County. And my parents grew up a half mile apart on a section line neither of my parents ever dated anybody else in their life except each other. They're 9 years apart in age. Dad went away to World War II, and when he came back and settled in Portland, Mom worked to make enough money as a waitress at the cafe in Webster. And then her and my Uncle Maynard, Dad's youngest brother, hopped on a train, went to Portland, and so Mom and Dad eloped. Wow. And then came back to South Dakota after they had a couple kids.
Did she work in the industries during the war?
No, because the war was over. When Dad came back to Portland after the war.
This was after the war.
No, but Grandma, his mother, worked at the depot out at Igloo. And in fact, my aunt has pictures. She showed me there was a high school at Igloo, and she talked about taking the train into Edgemont to dances and to Hot Springs.
Crazy times.
So we're pretty South Dakota.
Yeah, very much, very much. I think this next is considered a baseline question, but I'm going to probably save it for after we get into specific topics. Let me just tell you what the question is. How has your involvement in South Dakota politics in the general era of 70s through middle 1990s influenced your career trajectory?
It's pretty much is my career.
I think we'll get there with some of the other questions, if that's okay. And I've also heard this before, but it's a great story, so I like to hear it again.
Is this going to be the one about Janklow pulling a gun on me?
No.
Okay, because that's a great story.
But we can do that one. This is more about your early start and the Abner years and all that. So how and why did you become involved in South Dakota government?
When I was in high school, I wanted to be a page. Mary McClure was my senator, longest serving president pro tem in the history of South Dakota Senate. But it conflicted with debate in high school. So I had to pass on that. So I went to Augustana to debate. And you could apply to be, and she had told me you should apply to be an intern And so when I was a sophomore, in those days we had a lot of applicants. Usually they were juniors and seniors. But anyway, I came as a sophomore. And Clint Roberts, who was the president pro tem then of the Senate, so I worked for him and Harold Halverson. Okay, so that's like real politics, but I should add that my grandpa, Antone, I'm named after, county commissioner, Democrat county commissioner in Day County, got me a job after school sweeping at the courthouse, and it was a patronage job. To his chagrin, Sigurd Anderson had come back out of retirement to serve because they had a vacancy on the bench. And so I would be sweeping the courthouse, and Sig, former governor Sigurd Anderson, now retired, out of retirement, circuit judge, they were paying me, and I was sitting there listening to him tell stories about politics every day. And so probably by the time I was done being a janitor, I was a Republican. And always bugged my grandpa.
I was going to say,
Yeah,
I'm sure your grandpa wondered about that.
When I went away to Augustana, when I would come home on the weekends, my mom would know where to find me, which was over at Sig's house. And I'd just sit there, and he would tell stories that would go for hours. I wrote, as a freshman in college, I wrote for two different history classes. One of them is The Immigrant Becomes Governor, is Sig Anderson's biography. And I tape recorded 4 or 5 hours of him just talking about his life from Rolandbark, Norway, all the way to Webster. And then the second semester was, I did Frank Ferrara, the young man in the governor's mansion. And so, I don't know, you collect all that together. Yeah. And then I ended up as an intern, and I was standing up in the hall up there. Is that the? No. Then the next year I came back to be an intern again for Mary Edlin, Don Peterson, and Frank Tiemann. And Augie had the interim short, the J term, so it fit perfect. It was many of the interns were Augustana students because when it was the short session back in the old days,
you didn't miss any.
Didn't miss class. Then the long session, you had to give up second semester, and I did that my junior year. And while I was there in the hall, a friend of mine, Clyde Sockerson, who was Janklow's legal counsel, Sock said, "Hey, we're going to go to the Lincoln Day dinner in Potter County tonight. Why don't you come with Congressman Abner and I think maybe Mike Valley before he was ever in the legislature." And so we went up, that's a Hovind. It's a Catholic community. And I said, they're Republican. They're all Republicans. It's got to be the only Republican Catholic community in South Dakota. And anyway, I drove Abner up there and back. And in the upshot of all that is I ended up with a job working.
Did you know him before that?
Never met. Couldn't pick him out of a crowd of two. No, he was a West River congressman in those days. The session got over, and I couldn't go back to school because we had to give up second semester. I had a Catholic church retreat I was going to go to up in Aberdeen. Had 2 weeks to burn. I just drove around the state shooting the breeze with friends, and I stopped in Mitchell, Dorothy Nepstead, former Representative Nepstead. She knew me from the legislature. I didn't even know what her job was. Turned out she was Abner's field person in Mitchell. I just stopped to see her, and he was having a grand opening for his new office there, which I didn't know that either. And I stopped in. I didn't even know that's where she worked. Clyde told me to go there. And they said, well, she's across the street with a congressman. I go across the street, and she gets in Abner's face. "You need to hire this young man. You've got to run statewide in 2 years." And Abner just knows me because I drove him one time, and he said, well, go across the street and write something down. So I went across the street, took a sheet of paper, and said, well, I didn't have a job, and I couldn't go back to school till August, and this is in March, or early April, whatever. Anyway, I write out a thing, and as I'm doing it, Clyde Sockerson walks in. And he says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Abner told me to write this up. Maybe he's going to hire me." He said, "Give me that." And he took it, and I said, "Sock, don't screw around with that," because he was kind of a drinking buddy. And he wrote something on it. Abner walked in, he handed him the envelope. I never saw it. And I'm at this Catholic church retreat up at Presentation College, and they said, "Hey, Lee, there's a phone call for you. It's Congressman Abner." I said, "Yeah, right." "Hello? Congressman?" "Boy, I just saw the Bullets play," which is what the team used to be called. And "I just saw the Bullets play. Alan Sol, he's so good. You want to come to Washington?" And the rest is history.
Wow.
So.
But you finished college, right?
Well, yeah, because I had quit then, and I didn't know what I was going to do, and And then Abner said, you really ought to go get your degree. So I...
Says the school teacher guy.
Yeah. So when we hit, and I hadn't made my mind up about either where I was going to go or whatever, but anyway, so I decided to go back, and I came back to Augustana in the fall, and we were getting ready for the 1980 U.S. Senate race. Then he was going to take on McGovern, and so Troy Jones and I and Bill Protexter traveled around the state of South Dakota in my car, organizing the campuses during our school year, and then I came back out as an intern the third year then, that time for Mary Edlin, who carried about every border regents bill in the legislature.
Wow.
And I got my degree. Wait, the last part of this.
One.
Well, yeah, that's true. But the last part of the story on the first one is I'm sitting up in the cafeteria at Augie saying, well, I don't really want to go to law school. I've been accepted. I said, I don't really know what I'm going to do. And I checked, and it turns out in those days, now you can get teaching jobs without certificates, but you couldn't then. And I looked and I said, I can't even teach. I don't even have those classes. And then Abner said, well, come to work for me. So he came to my college graduation at the arena at Augie. And then when my parents left, I went over to the campaign headquarters and went to work that night.
Wow.
So, and then I was on the campaign staff.
It just goes to show connections are everything, aren't they? So, okay, we started with the early work on the federal level, but tell us about your legislative experience. I know you've had a couple different times at it. I remember
Four
early
times.
Well, especially back in the early 2000s, I remember, and then you took a little break.
That was the second time I was here.
Well, okay. That was when I first got to know you, I think, because I was started with Tad at that time. Anyway, talk about the times, your legislative experience, and how many years, and which parts, and which bodies, and committees, and all that fun stuff.
Can I tell you about the first campaign? Campaign?
Absolutely.
Okay. So actually I go back home. So I finished my degree. Actually, I got to fill a gap in here. We win the 1980 U.S. Senate race.
Right.
I'm driving 1,200 miles a week, working 90 hours a week, handling 14 counties. McGovern won 13 of them 6 years before. We swept all 14 of them. I had a couple thousand volunteers, and I was all over all the time, and I was exhausted. And I heard a radio ad. I've been warned that when you get done with a campaign like that, you'll be physically exhausted, but this was something I'd never experienced. And I heard a radio ad that you could take a Greyhound bus, $100 round trip to anywhere in America. And I have relatives that live just north of the border in south of San Diego. I mean, you can hear the migrants coming through the swamps. That's how close they live, and right off the ocean. There's no farther place you can go on mainland United States than my relative's house. I bought a $100 bus ticket, got on a bus, and lived on a bus, just getting off all over, and then sleep on the bus. And I had a few relatives I saw on the way, went down there. Actually, Mary Duffy, Kevin Wooster's wife, Mary Garrigan, her brother, there's like a dozen of them Garrigans from Highmore. One of them happened to be on the bus with me. We were bums traveling across western United States. I'm laying on a couch down at my relatives in California, and Abner calls me up and says, first he says, do you want to go to Leroy Hoffman's funeral with me? Charlie's dad. Yeah. And I said, well, I'm California, Jim. I'm not. And he goes, well, do you want to come to work for me? I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just laying here on this couch watching MASH like 12 hours a day. And well, send me something. So there's no kidding, I took and the Republicans took control of the U.S. Senate in after the 80 election, which means a huge transformation of jobs. All kinds of people lost their jobs because all the committee chairmanships, all the staff changes. So every new senator was getting hundreds of resumes from PhDs and all these people. And so I took a sheet of paper. I was excited. It was a torn sheet of paper, and I wrote, Senator Abner, I'd like a job, Lee. And I rolled it, put it in an envelope, mailed it to Vern Lowe, and his chief of staff was furious that he got this crappy piece of paper that was torn and that he had to hire him. So anyway, I got a call.
He told you to write something.
I did. It was the second time I did that for him. Anyway, I ended up in D.C., And I stayed there.
So that was the second time.
Second time, yeah. But then I wanted to come home. My dad was sick. My sisters were calling me all the time about it. So when Abner left for the August recess, then I handed him my resignation, left town, so he didn't know about it until he got. I was out of D.C. before he found out. Went to USD, got my law degree, came home, got elected state's attorney, did one term, quit doing, didn't run again. So I'm a trial lawyer. I've set up an office in my hometown of Webster, enjoying life. Decided I want to run for the legislature. I convinced the Republicans in the Senate in 1990 redistricting to draw a district that's better for me than the one that had my county been split for 20 years. They put Day County back in one district. And I ran against a guy named Paul Simmons. And no Republican had won the seat since 1956. Pine Ridge and the Cathedral District had more Republican senators than Day County. And I campaigned everywhere, and I lost by 200 votes. And Jim Sawyer on Janklow's staff had told me, you're going to lose. Well, it was Mickelson's staff then. But he said, you're going to lose the first time, but if you keep running, you'll win the next time. And I swore at him, said, I'm not losing. And of course, he was right, because Sawyer was always right. And so in the 94 race, I run again, and I just never quit campaigning. And I drive to every farmhouse and every town, knock on every door. And there's more than 2,000. There's no district like that in South Dakota anymore. There's none that. This had over 2,000 more Democrats than Republicans. And the only places I would win were where there was a Catholic church. I got all the Catholic votes, but if you like, Western Marshall County is Protestant and Democrat, jeez, I'd get beat like 90 to 10% in those places. And so anyway, the votes come in, and this is the entertaining political story. There's a long lead up to it, but we're having a party at my office, election night. Numbers are coming in, and we're down by 21 votes, and it's like 2 in the morning, and everybody's drunk. And I said, look, you guys, we lost. There's 3 precincts left. They're Democrat precincts. There's no chance. Roberts County. I'd always carried Roberts County, but I wasn't going to. There's only 3 left. I made everybody go home. Oh, one out. Rick Rylance, who ran for the legislature and got beat this last time, was my treasurer or chairman, one or the other. I mean, I remember I made him get out of the office, and then we go home, and Donna and I are getting into bed, and she goes, well, you should just call one more time. I said, look, look, we got beat. No, call one more. So I call, because there was no internet. You know, it wasn't like you only found out because you called the county auditors, and you had to have a sheet of the precincts, so I called a county auditor in Roberts County, and I said, hey, it's Lee again. And they all knew me because I'm a lawyer in the area. I'm in their courtrooms all the time, courthouses. And she goes through the 3 precincts, and I'm adding them up in my head. And I said, well, then I'm ahead by 21 votes. It really was quite a night. So we were down by 21 votes. And now we won. The funny part, I get joked up about this, but the funny part of the story is this. I'm standing by the bed. Donna's kneeling on the bed. And I said, to look at Donna, I said, we won. She screams, jumps up, and busts the bed. Story gets better. So we go pull out the couch that folds out in the den, and we're sleeping. You know, we're just 2 poor kids with, at that point, actually 3 little kids. And at 6 in the morning, Rylance has sobered up enough to make a phone call. He goes, Lee, did we win or lose? He said, we won by 21 votes. On the radio, they're saying you lost by 21 votes. Paul was just on, about how he won. I said, no, they didn't get the last 3 precincts. So now I'm just as tired as can be. I only got 3 hours of sleep. I call up first Paul and say, Paul, I just want you to know, congratulations, good race. What do you mean? I said, well, I won. And he's mad. And that's a short phone call. So then I think, well, I better call the radio. Oh, Rick calls me back. You need to call the radio station. So I call KBWS. BWS stands for Britain Webster Sisseton. This is the area where I practice law. This is where my family is. All of our relationships are. At that time, it was the radio station, and the talk show in the morning had a huge following. So Johnny Sieber is a buddy of mine. He's a DJ, and so I start going through, and Johnny, and well, it was 21, but then I went home and I called, and they said we won, and Donna screamed and broke the bed. I said that live over the whole area. That was on Wednesday morning. Saturday, we found out we were expecting our fourth child, and that's not due to that screaming and breaking the bed on Tuesday night. But you can imagine how our community and friends who all heard the story, repeated on the radio several times that day. So that was the highlight of my election to the legislature. I've not had one since that was as memorable or as much fun. There was a recount in the end. We won by 12 votes. And then 2 years later, I lost by 100 votes. Because I was busy helping my buddy Mike Jaspers because I thought he should win, and he did. I should have campaigned more for myself. But it was a good thing because so that child was born, who's Jake, who just ran for the legislature and got beat by 80 votes. That's our baby. Politics permeate our life.
But that was in the House, right?
No, I was in the Senate.
Okay.
Yeah, I was in the Senate.
Okay.
Yeah. So because what happened is we had 4 kids 8 and under. Mm-hmm. And I'm a mechanics kid. I got no wealth of any type, and I've got to be working to be making a living. And it's a law practice I started myself. So getting beat was a godsend. And so then I was out for a while. So when you said the 2000, that was like I won the 2002 election. So it was 6 or 8 years, whatever it was. That would have been 6 years later. I'd already served 2 years. With Jim Thompson, Harold Halverson, my baby, Harold bottle fed him on the floor of the Senate. So anyway, I don't know where your question was. It got me off on that, but that's how I got started in the legislature.
The question was kind of trace your history of political involvement in South Dakota other than the Abner stuff. And so continue on then with the rest of your explanation about the rest of your legislative elections and
so
experience.
In the 95 election, that was the year of the Dakota property tax movement thing. And so Janklow, this is Janklow coming back in for his 3rd term. I got him appointed to a board. Dakota was a company, it was a publicly traded company based out of Webster, South Dakota, and he and I were on the board together, and we'd become very close friends. We campaigned around the state together, and I worked on his staff. I skipped that while I was in law school one summer. So we both come into office in '94, and I'm his best friend in the Senate by a long shot. He's been out of office 8 years. Some of these people had never met him, so I would spend every evening. First off, in those days, because you had to return phone calls and you had to there was no cell phones, you used the Watts line up at the Capitol. Everybody came back to the Capitol at night to call their constituents back, to call your kids, put them to bed, all that stuff. Every night I'd be in Janklow's office. Him, me, Jim Hagan, who was his chief of staff, and Chris Graham, who was the scheduler. And so I served those 2 years. Jim Thompson was in the Senate with me, the rodeo guy. The gun story is in that time period. Then when I lost in '96, we had redone the state aid education formula as part of the property tax thing. It was huge change. Well, my wife gets elected to school board then in '97 and has to live with the spending restrictions. Her husband had helped get through the legislature by about 1 vote, and that was the worst year of her life, she would tell you. They made her president at the first meeting. So that a year into that, I have Janklow come up because the flooding has now hit northeast South Dakota. All the lakes filled up, '97. Bill comes up 2 days, and I set up meetings so he can see it. And when the meetings are over, I'm taking him to the airport. He goes, Schoenbeck, this flooding is really bad. He said, if I had a young family here, he said, there ought to be a wagon train going out of town. You ought to be leading it. And I was like, this is my home. I'm not planning on ever moving from Webster. He goes, get up on the plane with me. So I get in the airplane with him, and we fly around. And I understand, I've driven to every farmhouse in this county. I mean, I knocked on their doors when I ran for state's attorney, state senate. All the woods that are where Wabae Lake is under, I've camped in all those. I had keggers in those in high school. I always said, after all that flooding, I don't know where they have high school kegs anymore. Every grove of trees is flooded. So anyway, we fly around it, and we get back, and I'm driving into town, and I walk in the house, and I said, "Donna, let's go for a walk." And the upshot of that is that we decided that night to move to Watertown. And so in '98, we moved our kids and put them in school in Watertown, put them in Catholic school there, Immaculate Conception. And I was fine being a little fish in a big pond. I didn't actually move my law office for 2 more years. I commuted. And Don Brose was our state senator, and to describe Don as loud and boisterous would be an understatement. And I'd sat through enough meetings of listening to him that I just finally had enough. And so I ran against him in the Republican primary. He was the pumpkin man. He had a huge pumpkin patch. He gave, everybody bought their pumpkins from him. He put a pumpkin costume on and drove him in his little tractor out so the kids rode in the back and picked up. His wife was a kindergarten teacher forever. He was a coach. Anyway, but we had kids in every single activity, 4 kids. I went to one campaign function. Every other thing I did is just because I had 4 kids. Every night I was at stuff. The day before the election, I took one of my kids with me and went to the senior center for lunch because I thought, you know what, you ought to do that. You ought to do that once when you're campaigning. That was the only campaign thing I did besides put up signs. Never knocked on a door. And we carried 18 out of 23 precincts in that primary, and I never had a general. So then I came back that was the 2002. And I served in 3 and 4. And then I made my mind up to run for President Pro Tem, and they elected me to head the Senate in 5 and 6. But by then I had 4 kids at home. I was thinking about running for governor. I knew I needed I had work. I had to be working to make a living, and I had kids to raise. So I did not run for re-election then in 06. And then I actually campaigned for governor for about a month, and then said, I don't like being gone from home. I was out West River 3 weekends in a row, and I said, this is garbage.
So that would have been the election of what?
That would have been right after rounds, let me think. So Mike and I came in together in 2. He was governor.
Right.
And then, so he had just gotten reelected. Okay. And then I was running for what would have been,
so 10.
That would have been the election in 10, but I only was in the race for about a month.
But it would have resulted in
yeah.
campaign.
I think that's right. Seems like that's right.
I guess I'd forgotten about that.
And so then I was out of politics again, raising kids. Oh, and I made a deal with my wife. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll stay out of politics till the last kid graduates. And that was Jake, the baby. And so there were a couple times I said, I think I should run this time. We had somebody that I thought was an idiot or whatever. And you promised. All right, I did. So I didn't run. And then what happened is Jake graduated from high school in May of 2016. And that year, Neil Tapio had been our, did I get that right? Well, let me think. That isn't what happened first. That was the year I decided to run again. Donna was begrudgingly letting me run. Oh, that was the teacher pay issue had lit me up. That we couldn't even get applicants in Watertown, much less if you're in Webster or Waubee trying to get applicants. We just weren't paying enough, and they couldn't do it. We didn't have enough money. And so I ran for the legislature in 16. And the other House member, I ran for the House because a buddy of mine was in the Senate, Reed Helene. Melissa dropped out, so I didn't even have an election. And I served those so Jake graduated in May, and I got elected in June. And so I kept my promise. And so then I served 2 years, the whole battle on the teacher pay, which you can find newspaper and internet stories about that still. Got kicked out of the Republican caucus. Fought the majority leader on it, and he lost, and I won. And it took 2/3 votes to do it. So it was every procedural battle you can imagine. That's a whole book you could write about it. But when it was done, I said to my wife, these people are nuts. I want out of here. And I almost resigned halfway through it, and I said, no, I'm sticking it out. But I'm on a beach in Jamaica, and the phone rings, and there was a text from Roger Solem saying, Reed announced he's not running. One of us has to run for the Senate. And I texted him back, congratulations. But Roger wasn't very aggressive of a campaigner, and Neil Tapio, who was from Watertown, moved home for 5 weeks, I bet, knocked on all the doors of the 4x4 voters and beats Roger. And for 2 years, we had the embarrassment of Neil Tapio in the state Senate. If he wasn't the worst legislator in the history of South Dakota, he's damn close, although it's a competitive field. So 2 years later, I already knew I was running again, and there was no question. And then he went and ran for Congress, so I didn't get to run against him. But that's how I ended up back the 4th time. So I've had 4 non-consecutive trips to the legislature. Me and Al Howick are the only 2 in the history of the state. But Hal kept getting beat. That's why he had breaks.
I'm going to have him put his water here just because you keep picking it up. And
I'm sorry, my voice keeps breaking.
Yeah, you can pick it up. You may want to give him more breaks.
I think it's all the, no, I'm fine. It's just all the coffee I was drinking during the day.
I mean, we're at your.
No, go ahead.
At your,
Ask away.
Couple things I want to, that's great to set the stage for all the different times that you had, both in and out of the campaign light. Tell me a little bit more about I know it was a short one, but what brought you to think that you wanted to run for governor, and why, why so quickly that you were like, no?
I always thought I was going to run for governor. But I tell you, after 4 weeks, and I remember, I still remember, I had put together a campaign committee. We were going to meet in Miles Beacon's conference room. Joni Cutler, Jerry Apa was going to come out, Harry Christensen. I had a whole pie. I had about 25 people lined up to meet to do the planning to kick it off. And after those, I spoke at the Fall River Lincoln Day dinner, the Lawrence County Lincoln Day dinner, and I must have went to the one other event out there, 3 weekends in a row. And I came home and I said, it was going to be 4 years of that. I said, I'm not doing this for 4 years. I thought it was going to be Matt Michaels and I running against each other.
I was just going to ask, who all had already expressed interest or was in the race?
Matt and I thought we were going to be in a race against each other. Our last day in office, then him as speaker and me as president pro tem, we sat in his office and gave each other a big hug and cried. And I remember saying to Matt, I said, no matter what, I said, you're my friend, this is going to be a clean race. Well, Matt decided not to run before I decided, and then who I did not expect would run was, as soon as I was out traveling around the state doing those speeches and lining things up, Dennis Stugard announced, he went on the radio, because I was giving all these speeches. He went on the Pure radio station and announced he was going to run for governor in 4 years. And then he did, and I didn't. And then Knutson jumped in, and I can't remember who the other one was that Dennis beat. I don't remember.
So is that the only time you'll consider that?
Oh, I'm done. I'm not running again for anything.
I heard you say.
Yeah, well, I'm already recruiting a replacement for me for the Senate, and I have no plans to. I plan to spend up. My wife has paid her dues.
Fair enough. In your campaigns, you talked a little bit about how you campaign, visiting all the different farms and getting out to see people and stuff. But what was the substance? Did you talk issues? What topics were top of mind for you?
Well, those early races with Paul Simmons and I, it was abortion and income tax were probably the 2 biggest topics. Him pushing that I opposed an income tax, and me giving him grief for his votes against limitations on abortion in the Senate. Those were probably and those were nasty races. I mean, he and I didn't care for each other. Ironically, when I got elected in 2002, he was in the Senate still from District 1, and he sat right in front of me. And I get along fine with Paul now. But the other races after that, so like in 2002 with Brose, I made up my mind after that 1996 race, that I would never say another bad thing about an opponent in a race. Everybody's somebody's brother, mother, husband, kid, neighbor, and I was so not pleased with those 3 races. Paul and I 3 times against each other. So I have never said a bad word about an opponent in any race. I typically don't mention them, but I just don't say anything bad about them. Well, so Don and I didn't talk about Don. In fact, I had a Supreme Court oral argument the day he was on the radio, and he wouldn't debate me, and that's fine. So they would have us each different times on the one radio station, the KWAT. And so I had done mine, and I was up here arguing for the Supreme Court, and I knew he was going to be on. And I remember getting out as quick as I could and driving as fast as I could, heading for Miller. I had to get within range so I could hear KWAT. And I remember Don saying, and my opponent, all he wants to do is talk about camping. And because I'm a big hunter outdoors, and so I can tell you that in that race, I just talked about the importance of being involved in the community and education and the outdoors. And in 04, Claire Knoll, the House member, ran against me. I knew I was going to beat him bad. I didn't do hardly any campaigning. He wouldn't debate me either, but they had us on the same program together. And they flipped a coin. I knew I had to go first, and the first thing I said is, well, Claire Knoll, I was his treasurer. And if he wasn't running against me, I'd be voting for him. And poor Claire, he didn't know what to say after that. But I just, same thing. I care about kids. I care about the community. I think education is important, and I believe in the outdoors. The more opportunities are better. And so that was that one. When I ran, and nobody ran against me that 2 years in the House. First time back in the Senate this time, Byron Calise, who's in the House now, ran against me. I just went out. Again, I've never knocked on a door in Watertown, not once, for myself. For other candidates, never for myself. Just put up yard signs, do radio. And if somebody invited me somewhere, I'd go there and speak. But with Byron, it was, my thing doesn't change. I think it's about educating kids for the next generation, creating opportunity for people, and I care a lot about the outdoors. And against Byron, that's what I talked about. The next election, I've never had a Democrat run against me in Watertown. I had a Libertarian, Adam Jewell, nice guy, just a nice guy, and I still owe him a beer. He said if I beat him, I had to buy him one, and that hasn't happened yet. It should. Same things. The last race, I had one of these purple, they call them so Patriot Ripple. I call them the purple Ripple people, like a cheap wine that gives you a bad headache. I had one of those people run against me, and Colin Paulson. And he would badmouth me all over the place, and I never talked about him because I just ran my radio ads, said about how I'd voted, what I cared about. And I win almost all those races 60-40. There's 40% of the Republicans that'll never vote for me. And there's 60% that'll kill for me. And I take those numbers. Yeah. In the general, I do a little better. It's more like 80-20.
That's pretty good. I think we've covered this, the big political issues of the day that matter to you. You just talked about that. In terms of once you get to the legislature, and there's certain bills or topics that, first of all, do you introduce a lot of bills?
You know, I come every session saying I'm not going to introduce any, and then you end up with.
And I guess what's your philosophy about
Yeah, I'm okay. So I probably help place more bills with other legislators than what I take my. In fact, the biggest piece of legislation that I was involved in getting through, the 2 biggest this last session, my name isn't on either one. I mean, it's probably on them as a co-sponsor, but it's not the sponsor. I'm not the one that was in the news talking about them. So the bills that I mostly have done while I've been President Pro Tem have been somehow process related. If I see something that's screwed up about who appoints who to a committee, things like that, that needed statutes to change, I've fixed every single one of those. Yeah, everyone.
Procedural type.
Yeah, so like if it said the majority leader made an appointment, well, that's not the majority leader's job. It's not the minority leader's job. It's either the speaker or the president pro tem. They changed them.
One of those this year, didn't
Yeah, I fixed them all. There are those that would say, they would set a quota. They would say 4 people on the committee, 2 have to be from the minority party. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. That was in the days when I was here in the Senate, was 1916. But when 31 members of the 35 body are from one party, you've disenfranchised a whole lot of the voters and said that their person can't serve. And you've overrepresented ridiculously so the other part. And so I've gotten every one of those changed to that it's pro-rata to your representation in the body. And I've done that every year as I found one. I've done more, and then guys like Dick Teason, who I've known forever, who represents the sheriffs, every year he comes and I'll say, you don't need me to do that one, Dick. And, oh, come on, you always, so I have, but if you look, about every single year I've got one Sheriff's Association bill. But not a big, they're not big.
I think you've been trying to get rid of a mandatory report on intellectual.
In fact, I just today sent an email to the LRC staff about another report. I have, for the last several years, when I find these stupid reports that are just red tape bureaucracy that most of them, somebody 20 years ago or 40 years ago thought was a good idea and then nobody ever revisited it. There's one now for the Petroleum Release Compensation Fund. We get a report as a legislature every year. Nobody reads that. Nobody cares. You mattered when you were digging up all those fuel tanks in the 1980s and 70s, but it doesn't matter today. So I'm going to have a bill drafted to repeal that report. They're all in statute, so you got to do it with legislation. I've gotten about one report a year, some years 2, repealed. The one I haven't been successful yet is the one about diversity education, which has got to be the dumbest of all the reports. Really thick, means nothing. Political statement from 3-4 years ago that should have never happened. Anyway.
So you said you often help others with bills that you make sure they get introduced, but your name might not necessarily be on them as a prime or whatever. I assume that's a strategy, and what is that strategy? Oh,
well, yeah, it is. And I won't say the bill this year because that would sort of defeat the purpose of having help somebody else.
No,
if there's a capable new legislator who maybe hasn't been asked to handle something heavy, and you know they can handle it, and when you've got my job, and Matt Michaels, when he was speaker, was better at this than I was, of saying no about being on bills. Everybody comes to you with their bills. They all want to have the head of the body do it. But if you're doing your job, you're so busy all day long, running around plugging fingers in dikes, that you do not have time to be showing up in some committee to pitch some bill. So in any given year, I'll probably have one that I actually viewed as my bill, and then I'll have procedural bills and a few small ones somebody asked. But the bigger bills, I would rather see more legislators carrying water. It's really important part of the process. You want to teach people how to do the job, and they're all scared. I won't say the bill, but I'll pick on this one. Senator Toman, when she was a rookie, I said, a lobbyist buddy of mine I went to law school with, said, hey, I've got this bill, Lee, would you, and it's a licensure bill. And I said, you know what, I got somebody for you on that. Senator Toman is a nurse practitioner. She's got a license. She understands licensure in her field. And I had her, I can't remember now exactly I do now. But she did that bill, and she started out nervous about it. In fact, I can remember Helene Duhamel, the first bill I got Helene to take. I don't know, do you think you can do this? It's really not that hard. And it's especially if you've got one where some organization is doing the legwork for it. In both of those instances I'm thinking of, they were successful with their legislation. And if you do it, sometimes then they introduce bills after you teach them that you don't like, and then you're stuck with that too. If Senator Tobin's listening. But that's why you do it, is you want to, in times of term limits, you have to bring up new legislators fast. So I've had the last 6 years of appointing committee chairs, vice chairs, seating assignments, all that stuff. You got to put why'd you put that freshman as the vice chair? Because pretty quick they're going to be the chairman. It'd be nice if they knew what the committee did before that. So you got it done. So placing bills is part of the strategy of trying to improve the process.
So that leads me to a question that actually was discussed a little bit yesterday in my interview, but let's talk about term limits and how that has changed the legislative process for good or bad, and especially how has it impacted leadership such as people in your role?
Sure. And I'm actually an advocate of term limits, and near as I know, I'm the only person in leadership ever in the legislature that would say that. And I would first point out to you that we lose far more legislators to spouse limits than we ever lose to term limits, not even close. It's rare when you have what's going to happen this year in the state Senate, where you've got, I think, a group of 7 or 8 came in 7 years ago now, and all but like one of them, I think everybody but Brock Greenfield from that group, went the whole 8 years. That just never happens. People have lives, they have jobs, they have kids. Most people don't stay 8 years. It's if you did it by the hour, it's like 15 cents an hour probably to be in the legislature. Their spouses won't let them keep those jobs. So I would first say it's overblown when people say that term limits take a lot of people out, because for the most part it doesn't. And you get a fair number of people that move back and forth between houses. So you don't, Gary Kamak was our majority leader. Next year he's in the House and he's a whip. So you didn't lose that. You lose some, I agree with that, but you don't lose near as much as people say, and you get a fair number of people like me that are retreads, call them to come back. But I still remember in, trying to think, it would have been in 05 or 06, because in the 02 election, Dave Knutson, Tom Dempster, and I were all elected together. We drove out together for the first caucus that winter, in that November. And so then 2 years later, I'm the president. So 2 years later, I'm the head of the Senate. And I make Dave chair of one committee and Tom chair of another committee. So they're freshmen. And they've all had a lot of life experience. They've been in the legislature. They're rookies. And they were complaining about term limits. And I said, do you understand? You guys are chairing committees. Do you understand you wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't for term limits? If you have, back in those days, somebody stayed 20 years and they would inevitably be a chairman of a committee and they'd never leave it. So I think term limits have brought in new ideas that otherwise couldn't or wouldn't happen. And I think that it's generally for the better. And I'm a minority amongst legislative leaders. But then I've never had to have the Constitution tell me to go home either. I've never been term limited.
Let's take a little break, shall we? You can just, okay?
I'm going to take one last swig. All right, go ahead.
You can stop at any time.
No, that's all
and
right.
take-
No.
But the hard part is when you're talking with the water bottle, because you're like me, we talk with our
Okay.
hands. And so
So
you
what?
end up having this silhouette.
All right, go ahead.
All right. We talked about term limits. Kind of shift gears here a little bit to a little bit of the national level. What do you think, I'll just read the question and then you can respond in whatever way you think makes sense. What do you think about the national leaders like President, U.S. Senators, U.S. Representatives, and the issues of the day? What do you think about the South Dakota political delegation?
Okay.
I assume in terms of effectiveness
Sure.
or whatever.
Well, let me. The national challenge we have, I think, is 100% driven by the current media environment of if you lean more left, you watch MSNBC, and Rachel Maddow is the person who gives you your best advice about how to vote. And if you lean right, you watch Fox News, and Sean Hannity tells you how public policy should be made. And Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity are actors. They've never had to make a train run on time. They've never fixed a pothole. They are not accountable in any respect for any part of public policy. And so the crazy stuff these people say, that is the news that goes out, and then it. So first off, it's informing the electorate in a misinformed, ill-informed way. Now you've got political people that have to try and capture those misinformed souls who haven't seen the whole spectrum of things, who are getting their information from actors. And so those political people that run statewide, nationwide, they have to, they don't win if they don't get votes, so they got to go pander to whichever segment. So I think that great schism of information and relationships is why Washington has the problems it has. We've not, in South Dakota, historically, we've handled that situation better than most, and I say that from having first served in the legislature with 19 Republicans and 16 Democrats. So, and Kermit Staggers was one of ours, and he never voted with us for anything, Dr. No. So, that made it 18-17 right there. So that's a pretty close line, so we had to work together. And I will tell you that even now, when the Senate's 31-4, I created a message group that's got all 35 senators. There's a Republican one too, but I'll tell you, I got one with everybody on it. Well, everybody except for Freimüller and Pischke. So the 33 actual functioning senators. And people share what's going on in their family, what's going on in public policy. They say things amongst Democrat, Republican senators that you probably don't, in a lot of states that kind of sharing doesn't take place. And we work that hard during the session to make sure that, if there's something that gets decided in our caucus, either Casey or I are going to talk to Reynold right away and say, hey, here's what we're looking at. And if Reynold or Liz Larson or Red Dawn or somebody says, hey, we think, have you thought about this? We will take, that doesn't get ignored. They don't do that at the national level. And the challenge we have currently in South Dakota is our governor is busy pandering to that environment, and that doesn't help us in South Dakota, or certainly in the South Dakota legislature, with the issues we have to deal with and how we deal with them. I'm a generally optimistic person about life. I think it's about opportunities and challenges, not things you can't do. But I don't know how you solve that. I can tell you how I solved. I just started getting the Wall Street Journal again, which I used to quit getting because it was so damn thick and it'd pile up and it bugged me. I'm cheap, having all these papers I wasn't reading. Now you can go online and it takes you about an hour a day, but I'm up early. And it's, near as I can tell, it's the only place I can actually find out information that doesn't really spin one way or the other. And that's a lot of work to try and get the news. Most people don't want to do that much work and shouldn't have to.
How do you, I have noted that there is more, you brought it up because you talk about media, there's more state level media attention to the legislature in the last year or two than at least I've seen in a long time. What's your thought on that? How's it going for you?
I love it. Now let me first say that a good day in the legislature for a leader is if you're not in the news. But it's a good day for the legislature if the work we're doing is fairly communicated to the public so they know that you're not just out here having coffee. And I think the expansion of the media corps, that's interesting on a couple of levels. First, it's good for the state. And these are good reporters. These people that we have are really, really good. And it's good that legislators have to learn how to deal with the media. I can tell you, well, no question. When Spencer Gosh and I, for those 2 years, when he headed the board versus the year I did, because you alternate speaker versus president pro tem, he didn't want to tell the media anything. I'd say that's stupid. Why would you keep that a secret? My opinion is, I can tell you that I'll get an email. I assume you want this in public, because he knows my answer is going to be I can't imagine what it would be that I would say no. I think having an informed public just is It's just a better way to do business. And it's great having these people. I think the more interesting dynamic of that is why we have them. And it's a, Gannett News has certainly helped in that regard, because then they have ruined 3 newspapers, whether it's they or people shifting a lot of things. The alternative, it's weird to call that alternative media, because you generally think alternative is like punk rock or something. It's not. I mean, these people are mainstream media people just using different vehicles to
Alternative delivery.
Alternative delivery, fair. And I think that's been I think it's really been good.
Back to your mentors, influencers, you've talked about several already with some of your early professional work. Tell me again, and maybe expand on it, who you consider over your whole body of service your biggest influencers, mentors, professionally, personally?
Sure. Well, Sig Anderson in the earliest of days, without a doubt, and I've already explained that to you. Jim Abner, I mean, I lived with Jim when I was in D.C. I mean, he was a huge influence, and he kept track of all of us Abner kids long after, we weren't on his staff anymore. Jeremiah Murphy, not the Jeremiah Murphy that's in the Capitol now, but the father of that Jeremiah Murphy, was a huge influence in my life. Got me into Georgetown Law School. I didn't go, but he got me in. I wanted to come home instead, so I left the Hill. But the dean of the law school did call me and thank me for giving him the opportunity to meet Jeremiah Murphy, or to talk to him and get to meet him. Murphy was a lot more influential than most people in the state knew. But he was a big influence. He was a calming, just sage advice guy. And then I chuckle when people say sometimes, you sound like Janklow, because, Jim Abner probably did a lot to start me, because I worked public policy for him on the Hill, transportation issues, railroads and stuff. But Janklow, certainly if you work on his staff, and then serving 2 years in the Senate where I was with him every night, and big influence. But I'll tell you a great story. So the guy who I would describe as one of the biggest influences in my political life pulled a gun on me and threatened to shoot me. It's a true story. So Janklow was furious about, he had a work comp bill that was a terrible bill in the 1995 session. And a guy named Ray Trankel was then head of the chamber, had pushed him to do this. It was a terrible bill. And Mitch LaFleur and I were 2 attorneys that made up part of the 19 Republican senators. And I went to Lars Herseth, and he agreed it was a crappy bill. And in those days, there was a union presence still in the legislature, and they were opposed to it. And so Mitch and I got all the 17 Democrats to agree to kill the bill. And so we killed Janklow's bill. And I was in his office every single night, and I get a note, hey, the governor wants you to come down. It was in the afternoon. I walk into his office, and that was when the current governors flipped him, but it was the small office back there. And I walk in, and you can ask Chris Graham and Jim Hagan, and they will both tell you this exact same story. The only part I'm adding is something they told me that I couldn't see because of what I was paying attention to. But Janklow was sitting behind that big desk. I'm standing in front of it. We must have been out of session in the afternoon. It was this afternoon during the Senate. Chris and Jim were standing right there. The door to get out is there. And then there's that ceremonial, the door that's now the current entrance to the governor's office was always there. And I was standing there, and Jank goes, God damn it, you and LaFleur, and you went and met with the Democrats, and you killed my bill. You son of a bitch. And he pulls his drawer up, and he pulls out the biggest silver-plated pistol. Looking at it from this perspective, to my mind, it was the biggest gun I've ever seen. It is the pistol that the Israeli government gave him because his father had been a Nuremberg criminal trial prosecutor. It was a big pistol, and it was loaded. And he pointed it at my head, just like what you got he swung it like this. And Chris and Jim, I saw this part, they hit the floor. And he pointed at my head just like this. What I couldn't see, because I'm looking at the gun, is, and if you ask Chris and Jim, they'll tell you they were crawling as fast as they could to get out that door. And they now will frequently add, and wondering how we were going to clean the blood up. And he said, I ought to shoot you, you son of a bitch. And I'm looking at my friend, the governor, with a cocked pistol pointed at my head, and I said, you can't shoot a senator in the Capitol during session. God damn it, he put the gun back in his drawer. True story. That was what life with Bill Janklow was like. And he'd probably give you a hug 5 minutes later. So, yeah, he was a big mentor. I almost wrote my obituary.
Well, I'm glad we got that one on tape. What advice would you give to, you talked about a little bit in terms of introducing bills, but what general advice would you give aspiring politicians, legislative candidates, people who want to get involved in any level of public service?
Sure. Well, and maybe just a little context there. For the last 2 election cycles, I've been out recruiting candidates all across the state of South Dakota. I said that in the last election cycle, I bet I had 100 different people tell me no. I haven't been turned down that much since I tried to get a date for the high school prom. I mean, it's the process of explaining to people why they should run. I'm an expert on that. But the other thing is, and I can talk about that, but this last year, I had 2 different, one dinner and then one just a meeting with new legislators, brand new ones. And I had a dinner for them, and I have a handout I gave them. I said, look, it's like 16 points about things you ought to know to be successful here. And you know, each of them has a story that goes with it. And I mean, it's just bullets, but I know the story. And so I can even tell you a few of those, but I've done that to try and help those young, some of them are older than me, most aren't anymore, about how to be successful in the process. I mean, things like, I still remember Mike Rounds saying, you need to keep your powder dry. He was majority leader. I was a new senator. And I tell these new legislators, I said, you know, everybody comes to you with a story and you listen, like, oh yeah, I'm for that. And then you find out that was the dumbest thing you ever said, because when you heard the other half of the story, those people either weren't telling the truth or didn't understand it. So Rounds, I remember him telling first week, you got to keep your powder dry. Another one that's on that list is, I call it the first rule of holes. And I still remember Rounds saying, and he's only part of like 2 or 3 of these, but those 2 happen to think. I still remember him saying, you know, to the caucus, as he's majority leader against that first term, when you find yourself in a hole, quit digging. First rule of holes. Second rule of holes, remember the first one. So I had a whole lot of advice. One of the first things on that list, it says, answer the bat phone. And I had to laugh because when I explained it, I forgot to add the part, because I think everybody is old enough to know that the bat phone is from Batman, and the phone rings and he answers, and I think it's the commissioner calling him, Commissioner Gordon. One of the young legislators said, you call your wife a bat? Because the point of answering the bat phone is that when your spouse calls, answer it. And all the legislators know that if they call, if I'm on the phone with them and my wife calls, they get hung up. I just say, I gotta go. And they all know it, because you always take the bat phone call. And to be successful in public life, you have to make sure you've protected those relationships that you have at home. So answering the bat phone is, I think, number 1 on the list of about.
I'm glad you explained that, because I know what the bat phone is. I wasn't sure how
It's the important call.
Didn't know how it worked in your situation.
But with why people should be involved in public service, I mean, I tell them, these days when we just got talking about this stark difference that's going on out there and how many crazy people there are, I mean, if you don't like it, you better do something about it, because if you say, that's all too crazy, I don't want to do that, guess what? The only people who will do it are crazy people. I mean, it's that old line about how the ignorant people will wear you down and beat you with experience. You can't turn the system over to the crazy people. So I go out around the state and tell people that are respected in their communities, you need to step up if you care about your kids and your grandkids. And you know, there's a lot of people out there that respond to that because they care. I mean, you're not going to get someone that are going to do it for 20 years because they got a life, but you can get somebody to do it for 2 or 4 or 6.
So apparently, perhaps you have encouraged or at least been an example to some of your children since they've expressed or tried.
Oddly, the most political one, she's going to have a baby in September, our first grandchild. She's practicing law in Sioux Falls. I always thought she'd be on the ballot before any of them, Erin. But at least for now, she's not. She practices law with Russ Janklow and Scott Abdullah in Sioux Falls, so that's a pretty political environment to land in. But the baby, Jake, is running again. He got beat by 80 votes. He now understands that you don't go golfing or to be in weddings with your fraternity brothers in Minnesota in the last few weeks before an election. You have a different job, and he will be busy.
So did you encourage him?
No, I didn't.
Did you ask for advice?
Yes, he did, and I give it. But you know, challenge for young people is, you know, at some point you have to make a living too. And so I would not encourage somebody that's, you know, 25 years old. I shouldn't say I wouldn't. If people in the community say, this is a good candidate, would you talk to them? I will. But I still remember, God, if I started making a list, I could tell you stories. But John Thune worked for Jim after I did. I mean, I was living with Jim, and I remember him come back one week and say, God, I saw this Myrtle game. This Thune kid is really good. And that was John. And so now I'm in the legislature, and John wants to run for Congress. And Bill Janklow wants rid of Carol Hillard so bad. And so, you know, we get Carol to run for Congress, because then we don't have that problem in the Senate anymore. And Janklow wants her gone bad. And so Carol runs, and my intern, Chris Hull, who I brought to Pierre, is still here ever since. Chris goes and is her driver on her campaign. And John Thune wants to run. And I remember 2 things. I remember Abner was not in favor of John running, because he said, Lee, he's got little kids and he's got no money, and this is his job. He was the head of the municipal league. And if he loses, he's broke. He can't afford to do this. So Abner was very concerned. I remember calling up Larry Gabriel. Larry was majority leader in the House. I was in the Senate, wasn't in leadership then. And I called Larry up and I said, look, this summer at the convention, let's get Thune the PUC nomination. And he said, Lee, you know, I know this sounds crazy, but he thinks he's going to win that congressional primary. I said, he ain't going to beat Carol Hillard. She's ahead of him. The polls show 3-1. It ain't going to be a race. He goes, Lee, I know it sounds crazy, but I said, well, I'm just telling you, Larry, we need to get Thune that PUC nomination when he gets beat, because Abner says he needs a job. So there's a story about a young person running. That's worked out pretty good for Senator Thune. I like to tell that story about him in the PUC nomination he didn't get every time I introduce him at something.
Going back to, we talked a little bit about term limits and your thoughts on that. I'm curious if there's anything else in all your experience in the legislature that you see as things that the South Dakota model, the way we do it here, is particularly effective or not effective. I'm thinking in terms of length of session. What do you think about that? Should we have different terms instead of this 2-year all the time? Should it be different? Or are we settled pretty well just based on the history you've had with the body?
I think our short sessions are really important. We get our work done fast. We wouldn't get any more or better work done if we were there longer. So I think that's really important. I think some simple things like the fact that we have a rules review committee, so that we're a check on the administration. Any rules that they want to generate, we have to sign off on them. I think the investment council is something South Dakota does, better than anybody. Coupled with the retirement plan where you can objectively say that, right, I just saw the report this morning, we're 101% funded. There may be one other state in America that's near us. I mean, most of them are so underwater because of letting politics dictate. Look, it's all politics, but I mean, bad politics dictate their retirement systems. Some of the best things we do, we as Republicans were forced into. It isn't that we chose it. And that was when the Democrats had control of the, I think, House for 4 years and Senate for 2 in the Knipe years. Prior to that, bills didn't have to get hearings and didn't. And if they got hearings, it didn't mean you were invited to the hearing or knew about it. Jeremiah Murphy would tell stories about, he'd see a committee chair who he knew his bill was in that committee, and he'd see him and some members of the Senate or House going into one of those rooms, which are now offices, but those used to be the committee rooms, and the door would shut, and they may be having a hearing on your bill and you weren't invited and didn't know. So the 48-hour posting requirement that we have now and the fact that every bill gets a hearing are huge. I just think those are really, really valuable improvements and important parts of the process. We really, really do that right. Every bill getting a hearing is important.
And it's interesting that I think so many people maybe don't understand that not many years ago it wasn't that way.
Yeah, well, it changed in 72 or 4, right in that time period. So in our time period, it seems like not so long ago. I can tell you there are people in the legislature that are so young that they weren't born yet then. They think that's a long time ago. When I talk about Ronald Reagan, they sometimes wonder who I'm talking about.
Okay, that brings this question, and we're down to about the last 3 or so, and then any other questions you'd like to offer. Looking at the political environment right now, how do you compare it to the political environments that you were growing up with in the 70s and 80s? I'm talking about South Dakota level political environment.
Sure. I'm in an aberration because I grew up in Dade County. I mean, Janklow used to say to me, "You live in the only place in South Dakota where they want an income tax," and that was true. In Sioux Falls, the Minnehaha County Massacre, back when you ran at large in Minnehaha County, when you went in to vote, you voted for 5 senators and 10 House members before we went to the single-member districts. Because Knipe's income tax bill that his lieutenant governor voted against to break the tie to kill it. But that next election, the Democrats lost. They had almost all 15 seats in Minnehaha County. They lost almost all of them in that election, the Minnehaha County Massacre. In my area, 25 years later, in my Senate races, I would have people screaming at me because I didn't support an income tax. So I came from a different environment, the Farmers Union, and the McGovern roots ran really deep. I mean, Mitchell and my area were kind of the holdouts for that area where the populist liberal McGovern politics really controlled. And so I came from where you had to fight to be a Republican. There was no freebies about this. I mean, I set up 2 Cracker Barrels every Saturday when I was in that district because I thought I know this is a hard seat to hold. And I would travel, I'd maybe be in Rosholt and in Webster or Bristol and in Sisseton. So I'd be going 100 miles every Saturday, and my hands would shake when I was going to those things because I knew I was going to have this, I called them sport bitchers. They would go to one and scream at me in the morning, and then they would drive 100 miles so they could scream at me in the afternoon about the exact same thing. And it was almost always, "You're a lawyer, you don't pay any taxes, your thing's all in your briefcase." And they forget I was a mechanic's kid that grew up there much poorer than the loudmouths that were yelling at me. And I pay income tax and they weren't. But they would. So I've never seen what a calm environment looks like until I moved to Watertown. And in these more modern times, I just don't get I don't get that grief from people, but most people don't want to have the fight. Maybe I've gotten better at the battle. So whatever everybody else is going through, like in the Black Hills with Citizens for Liberty, raising hell and all these things, I just don't get people doing that to me. I don't.
No colored postcards and campaigns?
They send them, but they spent almost $150,000 to try and beat me in the last election, more than they've spent to beat anybody in the history of South Dakota, and I got 60% of the vote. My friends throw them away.
Okay, we talked a little bit about today, how it compares to maybe 30, 20 years ago. Switch that. How do you see the political climate in South Dakota unfolding into the future? Changes? Status quos?
Well, first thing is, for the last 2 election cycles, I've got the business community engaged in primaries, which they refused to do before that. And they have to, because you can't concede the primaries anymore in South Dakota. If you give up the Republican primaries, only care about general elections, you just whistled through the graveyard and missed everything. So assuming they stay engaged, I hope that we will keep a legislature that is reasonable in both houses, in the majority. And I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican, I care if they're reasonable. That's what I care about. And I'll just say that's not a free gift. So what do I think is going to happen in the next 20 years? I don't know. I hope people care enough to keep not letting those postcards you referred to be what decides who serves in your legislature. Because we've been through a few years of that, and they were embarrassing years. So I hope that doesn't happen. I think it's going to take a lot of work. I think it's tougher to be a citizen today because you don't get as good information as easily as you used to. And so my hope is that we have enough people who care enough to work hard to keep people informed so that the next 20 years are good for our state. We're a small state. We don't got a lot of room for error. We really don't. We need to get it right.
What do you say is the biggest, just looking at this past legislative session, the biggest achievement and the biggest disappointment?
Well, the housing legislation was easily the biggest achievement, and maybe the biggest disappointment because the governor keeps trying to frustrate it. She did all last summer, and now again fire in the head of the housing right after the day after we leave town. But assuming we get that somehow through those impediments the governor's thrown in it, that's huge. $200 million in infrastructure. And then it's a third of any project, so that's $600 million. That'll put up a lot of workforce housing across South Dakota. I just got off a conference call of Senate presidents around America, probably 25, 30 of us on it, about housing. You know what, the first guy that spoke after the speakers, the main speakers, and they had Senate presidents. First guy was from Oregon. You know what his housing issue is? Homelessness. He got people in tents in Portland raising hell. When it was my turn, I said, you know what, that's not our issue. Our issue is we need to find affordable workforce housing for lower middle income families, and we got Spearfish has a great project going now that's working on it, but that legislation is the most important. If I'm going to pick out one just Lee issue, remember I told you I have like one bill a year that's really my bill? This last year I tried to get him to change the mandatory education for K-12 to 16 from 18, and there's a pretty simple reason, is because we did away with Plankington and all of our juvenile correction facilities, so we're using our high schools as our literally, I'm not making it up, we're using our high schools as our juvenile correction facilities. And if you can't kick those criminals out when they're 16 and 17, make them go get a job, take them away from that environment where they're terrorizing kids. I mean, they are criminals. They aren't just not criminals because you didn't send them to Plankington. You instead put them in a high school somewhere in South Dakota. The education community, it makes no sense to me that one of the biggest things they get beat up at in their communities are issues within their school environment. This is about fixing some part of that, and every single lobbyist in the education world came up and testified against it. And this morning, before I left town, I'm on the Catholic school, our little elementary school foundation board, and we got a report. And you know what's going on? Our numbers, they're going up. You know what's happening in our public school in Watertown? They're going way down. And that's true for all of the private schools in the area. And it's true for the small schools are all holding their own or going up. And schools like Watertown are dropping. And it's because you've got one part of it, and maybe other issues too. But if you won't fix your environment inside your walls so that it's safety for kids, you're going to have parents voting with their feet, and that's what they're doing. And that bill dying, and I could have got it smoked out, but I don't do that. I picked those committee. And I could have put that bill in a committee where I could have got it passed, but I wasn't. You got to play by the rules. I sent it to the right committee, and they killed it, and I accustomed the errors of their ways and moved on to the next problem.
Senate education, I'm assuming.
Senate education, all filled with friends of mine.
Got it.
Damn them.
So you saw that as one of the biggest failures or disappointments?
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting, and I'll just bring it up. It's interesting that you didn't mention in either side the sales tax discussion. What do you think about that?
That was dead before we ever got to Pier. I mean, that sales tax on food was never going to.
I'm talking about what the legislature did pass.
Oh, I'll tell you what I told the senators, and I told both House and Senate leadership. You know, this noise about we're going to have the biggest tax decrease in the history of South Dakota, which, by the way, I don't know if that's true. I think the one we did in '95 might have been bigger, but anyway, just assume for a second it is true. I said, you know, when you go back home, you're not going to be able to brag like that, because when you go to the coffee shop and say, I got you the biggest tax cut in the history of South Dakota, they're going to say, really, where? And you're going to say, well, when you pay for that coffee, well, not this one, because you won't save anything, but by the end of the month, you're going to have saved 10 cents for the coffee you've been having here. And they're going to look at you like you're stupid. And I told the legislators that. I said, that this is so inconsequential that I understand there are people who want news releases, but if you want to talk public policy, it's inconsequential. You got $800 million you're going to spend for 2 prisons, and you don't have the money. You know what you ought to be doing? I said this at a public forum we had in Watertown last month. Every household in South Dakota, if they knew they had a huge bill coming and they had a little extra money right now, every responsible one would put it in the bank to pay that bill, or they'd put it towards an account to pay that bill. Every responsible one would. None of them would say, I got a big bill coming, I think I'll work less, cut my revenue. And so that whole topic was so inconsequential in terms of the real world. It's that I say the same thing in public as I've said to the senators. Good luck bragging about that one.
The last question I'm going to pose, and then I'll check to see if there's any other questions in the room or anything that you want to cover that we haven't. What do you think about South Dakota as a place to live early on in your childhood and now?
I love it. We actually have 2 homes, my wife and I. One in the Black Hills and our home in Watertown. I think growing up in Webster was a gift. I never planned to move out of there, actually. I told you that story. I think South Dakota's a great place to raise a family. I think it's true if I don't care what part of the state you're in, or quite frankly, what color your skin is. I'll probably say with one caveat, which is Indian country is a damn tough place to raise a family. And that's a whole nother discussion of a whole different set of, so if you exclude those areas, which would be unfortunate to exclude from the discussion. I mean, you go to the north end of Sioux Falls or the Whittier neighborhood, which has got to be about that, and Lakota Homes and Rapid have to be the toughest places in South Dakota. And compared to the tough places otherwhere in America, they're nothing. And even in those areas, they're still good places to raise families. And if you move out to the Aberdeen and Watertown and Webster and Waubay and Rosholt and Isabel, I don't know about Isabel, they're just, so to raise a family, you've got a community around you that makes it easier, I think. It certainly was for us. Certainly was for my mother and dad with the eight of us that they raised. And into the future, I don't think we're going to see, I don't know, but the politicians will talk about, we're going to transform or this huge influx. There's a limit to how far that's going to happen. Our winter is our big controlling factor. I would say it keeps the riffraff out. I play golf at a course out in the hills, and one of my buddies, Donnie West, who's a native of Belfouche his whole life, 2 cops moved out here from Los Angeles, good guys. And they like the Black Hills. But you know what they decided after about 3-4 years now? They don't like the winters. They're moving to South Carolina. Our winters are the controlling factor. It takes character to live here. It's not easy. It's not free. I mean, our state bird that I hunt religiously, and I have 2 labs, and one of them bastards took out my grill while I was driving on the Polo Road on the way here. Rooster, and I did everything I could. Yes, just did it. And it costs about $1,000 every time you hit one of those things. It's a brand new Jeep. It's not easy. Some parts, I think it scares people off, and that's good. I think our state's going to be just fine going into the future. I'll tell you a little story. So when Jim Abner was in Congress, the office next to him was this guy, much like Larry Pressler, a Vietnam vet that had been elected to Congress on the same kind of, had town hall meetings all over in a little state called Tennessee. The guy's name was Al Gore. And in Al Gore's office, there was a guy named Sam Coleman Jr. who became a buddy of mine. I come back home and I get a phone call. Hi, I'm so-and-so from Smyrna, Tennessee. I'm a friend of Sam Coleman Jr. and I got offered a job at Stefan Mission, and he said I could call you. I have some questions about South Dakota. And she said, my parents said they'd buy me a car if I don't take this job. And she said, well, what is the housing like there? I said, well, you're probably not going to live at Stefan Mission. I think you're probably going to live in Chamberlain. Well, okay, well, are there malls there? I said, oh yeah, 180 miles in either direction. And the other part, I'll never forget about this, I'm pretty sure she didn't take the job. She said, well, in Vanderbilt, when it snows, I don't get out of bed. Does it snow there? I said, ma'am, you're going to spend a lot of time in bed in South Dakota. Our winters are a controlling factor.
A good way to end, but let me check to see if the boss over there has some questions.
Lee, you worked for a variety of different governors.
Well, actually, really only one, Janklow. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was thinking, Janklow, even in the legislature.
Well,
so,
Worked with. Yeah.
Worked with, yes, instead of worked for. Talk about, start in your early years and talk a little bit about the differences in the governors.
Oh, sure. Sure.
And you may be able to piggyback on that because I know that, no.
All right.
Go ahead.
Let me just take off with that?
Please do.
Okay, so the differences in the governors that I've known, worked with. So as a high school kid, understand my family, Congressman Denholm, by marriage is a relative. I have a grandpa that was a county commissioner and a cousin who was a registered of deeds, but my family was not involved in politics at all. My parents would talk a little bit about what was the issue of the day, but we just weren't involved in politics. They're too busy raising 8 kids, and when you're dirt poor and raising 8 kids, you don't got time for politics. I remember coming to Pierre with the South Dakota Bankers Association, had a business day, Bankers Day or something like the banking day, where seniors from around the state would come. And the drinking age was 18 back when I was in high school, and this was my senior year. I was 18. I remember we were down in the bar at the King's Inn, and this guy falls across the table, and I said, who's that guy? And they said, well, that's Governor Knipe. I did not really know Governor Knipe, but when I interned in the legislature in '78, he was still governor. That was before he took the ambassadorship to Singapore. And the one time I remember seeing him was when the personal property tax repeal passed. And the Republicans did not pass a replacement tax till the next year, but they repealed what was called the liar's tax. And he was in that private Senate lobby, and I remember he was trying to look over the transom, and he was cheering as they were voting. It was like a football, oh yeah, that one, yeah. And I remember watching, I thought it was kind of interesting that the governor was that committed to that. And then when I was in college, I wrote I told you those papers I wrote. Well, when I wrote the one on Farrar, I saw that there had been a paper written by this Gary guy that had been a kid from Salem that had driven Knipe around on his campaigns. So I called the governor's office to talk to that guy, and that guy got a phone. That's Rich Gary, later with 3M. It would be current Representative Drew Peterson's uncle, former Majority Leader Kent Peterson's uncle, and or if you're from Pier Fort, Pier Father Ron Gary's cousin from across the river. So I call that number from my dorm room at Augie back when you actually had phones in your dorm rooms, and I tell him what I'm doing. He goes, "Wait a second. Hi, this is Governor Knipe." And so for this paper, I'm writing about the guy he beat, Frank Farrar. I get to talk to Governor Knipe. And only in South Dakota can a college kid call a number on a lark and end up with the governor on the phone. So I didn't really have any other with him. And then after Knipe was Janklow. And he was Attorney General when I was in college. And I still remember Brad Johnson bringing him to a college Republican thing. And I'm saying, that loudmouth, I don't want to go listen to that. I remember he was a frumpy guy in a sweater carrying a leather satchel, which is how he looked for almost his entire life. And but I can still see him in the Grand Scow lobby at Augustana. And I just thought he was not my type, too loud. And then I worked for him when I was in law school and friends with him. And then I've told you stories about serving him. Janklow's leadership style was, is he led from the front. And I would give you a comparison, and this isn't meant to be derogatory, it's just different leadership styles. Dennis Dugard would lead from the rear. And the difference is, Bill Janklow would say, by God, this is my idea, and we're going to do this. Dennis Dugard would be far more likely to say, here's an idea. It's not the only idea, but if you guys can improve on it, but let's go this way. So that, and by the way, when you herd cattle, you herd them from the rear too. So it isn't like that's not, so that's two different styles. I don't know, Rounds was kind of different to deal with, and Mike's a friend. We served in the legislature together. He was governor, and I was the head of the Senate. He was more of a deal maker. He liked the art of the deal. Probably came from his professional world as an insurance salesman. He was always kind of trying to make a deal, and that isn't. I didn't see when I dealt with Dugard, when we passed that teacher pay increase, which if you go look and they'll say that's like Dugard's biggest achievement, but I got it through the House, and I never had one conversation with him ever during that entire process. He was not involved in it. We did try and involve him. We had a couple legislators we wanted him to talk to. He couldn't strong arm his mother into making dinner, I bet. That guy, those legislators came back up to the House floor, and they were mad at him. Okay, we're not using him anymore. And because I just don't think that's Dennis's style. He's more of a consensus person, and when you have to break kneecaps and twist arms, that wouldn't be his world. Janklow, on the other hand, could do that better than anybody. I can remember Frank Klochik coming back up on the floor, and he was all shook up, and Lars Herseth, the minority leader, and I are standing there, and Frank goes, you just can't, Janklow said he was going to throw me through that door out of his office. And Lars looked at him and said, you probably had it coming, Frank. It was, Janklow was a big personality, more than any of the other ones. Mickelson, I was a state's attorney when he was in office. I had campaigned for him for governor. I had a decent relationship with him, but we had a falling out over, I'm a state's attorney, and his answer to prison overcrowding is he went to a judicial conference and talked to the judges about why they shouldn't send people to prison, which made me mad as the local prosecutor was trying to send people to prison. And so a reporter called and asked, and I said, yeah, I'll tell you what I think about that. I'm out there for the taxpayers trying to put criminals out of our community, and the governor's telling the judges to quit sending them to them. I said, no, I think he's doing a terrible job on that. So I can't, something like that. I happened to be sick on a Sunday morning. I lived in this little farmhouse, a single out mile south of Webster. And I was sick enough that I didn't go to Mass. And that didn't happen very often. And the phone rings, when you still had phones on things like by your bed. And I answered it. And I was really sick. Lee, Governor Mickelson here. And he starts chewing on me about this interview. And I just said, Governor, I am sick and I don't have time for this now. And I hung up on him. It wasn't because I didn't want to talk to him. I was really sick. He took that pretty personal. We never really had another conversation after that. And Governor Noem, you know, I think I don't read autobiographies very often because I think the story of people's history is better written in hindsight than contemporaneously. Governor Noem and I have at times worked very closely together and at other times not worked very closely together. I thought she did a better job dealing with the legislature when she had Tony on her staff. She had some South Dakota people. I think she's got more challenges now with people that don't know much about South Dakota. I think trying to run for national office has a different set of challenges, and you got to try and speak to people on things that don't really have much to do with us here, and that's her challenge today. How history writes that book, that'll be long after I'm gone.
Did that help with your questions? Anything else from you over there? No, I don't think so. No.
Did I cover everything you want me to cover? Did I offend too much with my stories?
I just want to make sure, because I give you the last word on anything that you wish you had talked about that we didn't cover.
Well, and even what's the story that needs to be recorded in history that after Lee leaves, it's not going to be captured if you don't share that with us. And like I said, and you can, you know, those stories you can also say, hey, don't run this.
No, you can run any of those stories that I think I said. I just
always give everybody the last chance.
If I was going to say something that I would want people to remember who are maybe a little bit younger in the process than I am, it would be about the value of the process of the legislature. And Matt Michaels used to say that to me all the time, and I'd be thinking, would you quit saying that? But now I couldn't. It's really about giving people an opportunity to be heard, having hearings, trying to solve problems. The legislature is a lot more about trying to solve problems and looking for fights. The legislators that you see in the news piping off all the time, they're probably not the people that are doing the work that it takes to get things done. And so I would tell people that it doesn't matter if you're on the school board, city council, in your church council, or in your home, it's about being a problem solver. It's about being a workhorse, not a show horse.
Perfect way to end.
All right?